We are here with Helen Sunny Ladd as part of our series of interviews for the Sanford School of Public Policy's 50th anniversary. You came to Duke in 1986. You were recruited here as part of an initiative in order to increase the number of women who were full professors.
Full professors at Duke University, which I may refer to as Big Duke.
Okay.
So there was an initiative at the university level pushed by women, pushed by the few senior women that were at the university to increase the number of women at Duke. So what was then the Sanford Institute, which is what I joined, did not have authorization for a regular position, but if they could hire a senior woman, they could hire me, and that's what they did.
So tell me about that process and about how you even found this an appealing option, how you ended up coming here.
So one thing that helped push me here was I knew that the Kennedy School at Harvard, where I had been teaching for 9 years, was not likely to give me tenure. That is was a very male-oriented place. It's changed, and generally they treated me well, but there was a male who was going to get tenure and I wasn't, and I knew that. So I had to think a little bit about what my options might be, and ordinarily I would have just considered positions in the Boston area. I'm a Bostonian through and through. Grandparents were from Boston, parents in Boston, a lot of Harvard people in my family. I was very Boston oriented. Although I'd spent a little time out of the country. I did break away and go to the London School of Economics, so. But I didn't know much about North Carolina or other places. Now, ordinarily, I would have considered places just in the Boston area. I'd gone to Wellesley College. I went and talked to people at Wellesley, and I'd actually taught some at Wellesley. I'd taught earlier at Dartmouth College for a year. So there were places in New England that might have made sense for me. The thing that made it possible for me to come down here was my marriage was falling apart. So when Bob Bain, who was very active here in the early days of the Sanford Institute.
He had been the director, and then Phil Cook was just stepping in
yes,
as director.
So Phil Cook was the director when I came, but it was Bob Bain who I knew. He had strong ties with Harvard and the Kennedy School. So he said, why don't you come down and give a talk? And the combination of knowing that I was going to have to leave the Kennedy School and that my marriage was not perfect made it feasible for me to come down. And he and other people here did a good job. They didn't push me too hard. They said, why don't you just come and look around and find out what this place is all about? And I came, and they were nice, and I enjoyed my September 1985 visit to Duke.
Is it appropriate for me to ask you how you got your nickname Sunny? Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
As you know, my real name is Helen.
Yeah, right.
But that's the same name as my mother. And there aren't a lot of nicknames for Helen. So when I was born, when my father it was the end of the Second World War, and my father had been out in California on a ship, and he'd been in sunny California. When I came back and he saw me, he referred to me as his little sunbun because I was smiling and happy. So that nickname has come and gone throughout my life. At times I thought I should be more grown up and be Helen, and I write under the name of Helen. So now it's confusing to have two names.
And you thought of Duke, not in the way that Duke likes to think of it now in terms of this big global brand, but that wasn't your impression from New England.
My impression was that Duke was a terrific place, but it was an excellent regional university, and it had a good reputation, but it certainly was not global. I didn't even think of it as a national actor particularly, but I didn't know much about it. I did hear from some of my Kennedy School colleagues who did have closer ties with Duke and people at Duke that Duke was very much on the move, both Big Duke and the Sanford Institute. So I heard positive things, and that made it an attractive place, at least to look at.
Mm-hmm.
And I came down here and realized there wasn't a lot of snow. there would be some, but I could survive down here and wouldn't have to do a lot of shoveling.
And now you brought one of your sons, but not the other, correct?
When I came down here in 1986, my two sons were aged 12 and 14. 14-year-old had no interest in coming down with me. He was in high school, and he didn't want to leave his friends. But my younger son, I had a little more control over, and he was terrific. His name is Helen Ladd. The older one is Ethan Ladd. And Haven was willing to come, but he wanted to come just for 2 years. So he was at a private school in the Boston area, and we took him out of that, but they reserved a space for him. So he knew it was a 2-year adventure. And I use the term adventure advisedly. When I came down just before he did, in the summer of 1986, and I went to the airport to pick him up, and I was nervous about picking him up because he was leaving his friends and school and home and whatever. And I met him. In those days, you could go down to the gate to pick up, to meet people. Times have changed. And he got off the plane, and there I was, a bit nervous to see him, and he said, first thing he said is, "Mom, this is going to be just a fantastic adventure." And it just made me so happy, and we had a wonderful 2 years. Bob Bain had a son, Phil Cook, about the same age. Phil Cook had other children who were slightly older, and various other colleagues had children, so there were people for him to interact with, and it was terrific.
This place has a reputation for being a very collegial place that went back to the 1970s. I think Willis Hawley set up these beach trips that were annual affairs. Were the beach trips going on, and did you find it a very inviting place in terms of that sort of collegiality?
So I don't think I knew about the beach trips before I got here, but once I had a 12-year-old son with me and the opportunity to go with colleagues and their children to the beach. It was terrific. So I actually played an active role with Phil Cook, who was then the director of the Institute, in working up the details of these beach trips. I think we had one in the fall and one in the spring each of the years. So Phil would make the arrangements for where we would stay, and I'd work with people to make sure we had enough food, and people would bring different parts of food and do various aspects of the cooking. But they were great. We'd go out on the beach and play volleyball and swim, and it worked out very well.
You came from Harvard Kennedy School, which, as you said, was very male-dominated, but this place was also very male-dominated when you arrived. You were the first woman full professor, I believe.
That's correct.
To be tenured in the Institute. Was it important to kind of find a network of other women? How did you deal with those dynamics? I know that you were very well adept at working in male spaces, having been trained as an economist yourself.
Right,
so,
that's an important point. Economics was then, and still is to a large extent, a very male-oriented field, although it's changed. So most of my colleagues at the Kennedy School were male, although I had some female colleagues. And when I came down here, there was one woman on the faculty already, Carol Stack, who was tenured, not a full professor, and she was very helpful early on. And then there was another woman, Jennifer Widener, who was hired the same year I was as an assistant professor. So there were some women in the Sanford Institute, but she didn't stay. I think she stayed just a couple of years and then went elsewhere. But there was a group of senior women here at Duke, the ones who had pushed the senior administration to hire more women, and they took quite good care of me. So when I came down, they welcomed me, and they had a dinner so I could meet other senior women around the university, and that was terrific. Was
that very important for you, or was that just, do you think that you would have integrated into the life of this place relatively smoothly without that sort of network?
It was certainly helpful, and I'm glad it was there, but I'm a reasonably outgoing person, and I'm also was then a reasonably good athlete and a reasonably good tennis player. And I mention that because, as you know, often men like to interact together in ways related to sports. Phil Cook was a good tennis player, and he and I early on figured out that it might be fun to play tennis together. His wife didn't play, and we gathered another person from the business school, Joel Huber, whose wife didn't play, and I got another woman. We played a lot of mixed doubles, and that was important for interactions. Nice. It's important to have ways to interact with people outside of the office.
So when you came here, one of the things you were very quickly put in charge of was the Masters in Public Policy program. Tell me what it was that you saw the Master's program being when you arrived, and what were you trying to shape it into?
So it was very small when I arrived, and it was an MA, a Master of Arts program. I'd been at the Kennedy School, very involved in the MPP program, Master of Public Policy. And in fact, when public policy programs had been set up around the country, most of them initiated MPP programs. That was the reason for setting up public policy programs, to have a program that would train people to go into the public sector the same way business schools train people to go into the private sector. Duke was unusual because when the public policy program was set up here, it started mainly as a program for undergraduates, because Duke had a lot of emphasis throughout the university on undergraduate programs. So I don't remember what year the master's program, early 70s, the master's program was started here, but in true Duke form, it was just a Master of Arts program, because that's the type of master's programs that Duke had. And when I came, I knew it was important to single it out from other Masters of Art program that existed at Duke and make it into a professional program, to make it much more consistent with the types of master's programs that were being offered in other policy programs around the country. It is worth mentioning there's another type of master's program that we weren't pushing toward, which was a Master of Public Administration, MPA. So Princeton actually had a Master of Public Administration. But I was familiar with the Master of Public Policy, which was a very analytically oriented program, a program that would focus on analytic skills like economics and statistics and ethics and policy, making good policy and implementing good policy too.
Your research and your career has involved a heavy focus on the economics and sort of understanding issues from this very rigorous quantitative side, but you also have been very attuned to values and how to understand values. Is that something that you found that you were gravitating more and more as you came here, or was that always part of your research agenda?
That's a good question. When did I start thinking hard about values? I think it was when I was getting my PhD at Harvard in economics. So I got my PhD in 1974. My thesis advisor was Richard Musgrave, who was a giant in the field of public finance, which was my field for the first 15 or 20 years of my professional life. And he thought a lot about values, and I really respected his values and his approach. So I think right from the beginning, I understood that economics implicitly focuses on values, but they often say they're not focusing. Or economists often say they're not focusing on values. They're just trying to promote efficiency. But efficiency is a value, and one needs to trade that off against other values. So I think I knew that pretty early on.
Did you find that this was a good place to continue working in that sort of space with an emphasis on efficiency just as one of these values, not as the principal or core value?
As you know, any academic institution, the teachers have, or the professors have a lot of flexibility to do what they think makes sense in the classroom. Being in a public policy program was very different from teaching in an economics department, which I had done early on in my career before I went to the Kennedy School. But if you're going to teach students in a policy program, you need to think about values. So it was very natural for me to use some case teaching, which I brought with me, the skills to teach cases from the Kennedy School, and then to use them in the context of my teaching here, especially with respect to the master's students, the ones who we were training to work in the professional sector. But I found that those same notions worked well at the undergraduate level as well.
And that was the first time you were really using that case method approach to teach the undergraduate
Yes,
side.
because when I was at the Kennedy School, it was all graduate students.
Yeah. And did you find that kind of catching on around here, this sort of case approach?
Well, I tried to push it. And, in the non-economics courses, there's a lot of case teaching here. So people teaching politics or related courses would use cases. I tried to get some of my economist colleagues to use it. It's scary sometimes to teach cases because there are no right answers. And you have to be open to lots of different angles on a particular case. And I loved that. And I pushed some people in that direction, but not quite as successfully as I might have liked.
Do you have, by the way, any Terry Sanford stories? Because Senator Sanford, he had lost his election in 1992 and came back and taught here, and so there's a little bit of overlap. I wondered if you ever interacted with Terry Sanford, particularly given that you worked on a lot of state and local fiscal issues and then later education issues, which were dear to his heart, I think.
I loved Terry Sanford, and I was delighted he was here, and I got to know him personally. I don't have any stories of the type you're asking me about, but I was delighted that he came to my 1997 wedding to my husband, where my husband and I got married, and I have great pictures of him at that wedding with us and other people, and that pleases me.
You met your husband, Ted Fisk, when you were taking a year off at the Brookings Institution, is that correct?
Yes.
And this is when you're making this pivot to education from public finance. But I noticed that same year you were also the president of the National Tax Association, right when you were leaving that side of things.
I was president of the National Tax Association. That was the culmination of my work in state and local public finance. I had mentioned Richard Musgrave earlier. He worked mainly, as did most public finance economists, on federal tax policy. But Richard Musgrave, gave me an opportunity to write a book write an article or chapter for a book, and the chapter was on property taxes for a book that he was editing. And I started thinking about property taxes, and that forced me to think harder about state and local taxes. So that's how I made my career initially. I wrote a thesis related to local public funding, and then I did a lot of work on intergovernmental fiscal relations and tax policy. And by 1994, I knew I might be ready for a change. In the 90s, the economy was working very well, so there was much less fiscal pressure on state and local governments than there had been in the 80s. And so there was less funding for research and less compelling reasons to work on those topics. So at that point, I did make a conscious decision to go to the Brookings Institution, spend a year there working on education policy, but I thought I'd probably continue with both fields. But I was recognized by then as a leader in the field of tax policy, so that's when I chaired or was president of the National Tax Association.
Tell me about making this transition to education. And I'm also interested in whether you had a lot of support from the Sanford Institute. Did it matter at that? I mean, you're a full professor with tenure, so maybe you can do whatever you want in your career. But did it matter to Sanford at all that you were making this adjustment?
Haven't thought about it quite that way. I made the decision. I had an opportunity to go to the Brookings Institution. I had a year of leave, and at Brookings I could have done whatever I wanted. But if you're going to move into a new field, it's good to do it when you're on leave. So I set up a conference on education policy. Now, the one person here in the Sanford Institute who was quite instrumental in all of this was Charlie Klotfelter. Mm-hmm. So he and I had been classmates in the Harvard PhD program many years before. So I knew him. He was one of the people I knew as I was coming in to Duke. But I turned to him and said, Charlie, how about we write a paper together for this conference on education policy that I'm working on at Brookings? And he liked that idea, and that was an important thing for us to do because that subsequently led to many more co-authored research projects and additional funding that are continuing today.
You were able to use that opportunity and through that starting to build a lot of core data sets out of North Carolina. But how quickly did that develop out of your work?
Charlie and I were doing some work together, and then it was a few years later that we realized that we might be able to put together a big data set in North Carolina. Now, the whole field of education policy research had been changing and becoming more quantitatively oriented. That was one of the reasons I moved in. I was into that field. I was an economist. Earlier, most of the researchers in the field of education policy were not economists. Mm-hmm. They were people from education or psychology or sociology or whatever. But increasingly, people were thinking about notions that could be analyzed using the tools and concepts of economics, thinking about school accountability, thinking about school choice. But we needed data to look at that. So, trying to remember exactly what year it was, but with the help of Ken Dodge, who was head of Child and Family Policy. So he came in as head of Child and Family Policy while I was here. He understood that it would be useful to get some data. He's a psychologist by training. So we worked with the Spencer Foundation to get some initial funding that would allow us to encourage the Department of Public Instruction here in North Carolina to make available to us lots of confidential data. We had to set up a data center and to make sure that the data would be confidential. And so Ken was instrumental in that. I played a big role. There was a key person at the Spencer Foundation who played a key role as well. He had been aware that a lot of the funds for research and education from the Spencer Foundation had traditionally gone to universities in the North, places like Harvard or places in New York, and he wanted to expand out to the South. So we were in the right place at the right time with the capacity here because of Ken's focus on data and the Child and Family Policy Center, other researchers like Charlie Klotfelter, along with people at UNC. And we went in and got a big grant and set up this data center, and it's been fantastic. And not all other states have data centers. Only a few states have opened up their data to research, and North Carolina has been a real leader in this whole area, and the data center has been great and has served as the source of information for many of my papers, most of which I've done with Charlie Klotfelter and other researchers.
Did you find it difficult to pry that information from the state of North Carolina? And have you ever had any pushback about your access, not just yours, but all of the researchers here, access to that data particularly given that sometimes you might end up coming to conclusions that politicians don't appreciate.
Yeah, that's not where pushback has come from, because when we set up the data center, which started out as a joint data center between Duke and UNC, important to have UNC, a public university, and then eventually that morphed into a data center just at Duke because of the change in personnel, retirements of people and whatever. But right from the beginning, there were no conditions set on the types of papers we could write. It was important for us to inform policymakers about what we were writing about, but one of the conditions in the MOU, the Memo of Understanding with the state, was that we were researchers. We were not contractors doing their work. And so we have not had that problem. The biggest challenge we've had in the last several years comes from a slightly different source. Tremendous concerns in this state and many other states about confidentiality. We're using student level data, teacher data, and we always made the case that we'd keep everything confidential. We're interested in patterns, not in individuals. But we always get, or periodically we'd get concerned that state policymakers might say, why are we making such data available to researchers? But so far, so good.
Kind of tagging along with what you were just describing, you had many different collaborations that were part of creating that. And that seems like a core theme throughout your career, is having a lot of collaborations, writing a lot of things jointly, bringing various people's expertise to the table and seeing what you can combine together.
Right.
First of all, why have you gravitated towards collaborations as a mode of being, as an academic?
I think I do much better work if I'm interacting with other people. I like working with people. I think I like to be pressed in my own ideas. And I have to do that if I'm coming up with a suggested topic. Why don't we research this, or why don't we take this angle? I like it when people say, but that doesn't make any sense, or why don't we do this? But anyway, I very much enjoy working with others, and I think I do much better work, and I think they do much better work in most cases. And then as you are well aware, a number of my collaborators historically, well, not all, were economists, because I think like an economist. But even at the Kennedy School, some of the best work I did was on a tax policy called Proposition 2.5 that limited taxes in the state of Massachusetts. But I did that work with a sociologist. And that was much broader work than I would have done by myself. I've also written 3 books with my husband, who's not an academic, but is a journalist.
And as part of your adventures with your husband doing joint research, you'll have traveled to New Zealand and to South Africa. And so as part of your time here at Sanford, you've also been broadening out geographically some of the places that you've
and that's been an important part of my experience as an academic. So I've taken a number of leaves over my time here and had a Fulbright grant to New Zealand. My husband and I wrote a book on school competition in New Zealand. 4 years later, we went to South Africa for 6 months and wrote a book about the end of the apartheid era education system in South Africa. And then we went to the Netherlands, where I have grandchildren, and spent some time in Amsterdam, and most recently we've spent time in England looking at the system of academies in England, which is the English version of charter schools. And all of that research has made me a better researcher and writer about U.S. policies. One has to open one's eyes when one travels to another country and leave aside some of my starting assumptions and just learn what's going on in those countries. So it's been very rewarding.
I noticed that a lot of the faculty members here at the Sanford School have done a lot of collaborations and written a lot that's collaborative. But it does seem like for women there is a danger sometimes in collaborative work where there seems to be sometimes this implicit assumption that the woman who is listed in the chain of authors doesn't get as much credit for whatever the work is. Is that something that was ever a concern to you or something that worried you?
Turns out it wasn't a big concern because my main collaborator, not my only collaborator, but my main one at the Kennedy School had a last name that began with a Y. His name is John Yinger. And so that meant I always came first. There would be the two of us, Ladd and Yinger. So that really helped. It was a little bit of a problem when I came here and started writing with Charlie Clotfelter, because then my name would be usually in the middle of three authors. But that is a problem. But the fact that I was a full professor once I came here, I didn't feel that problem as much as a junior researcher might, where a junior researcher comes in as a research assistant for a senior person and then is viewed as the person doing the grunt work with somebody else doing the thinking. But that wasn't as big a problem for me. But thank goodness for John Yinger.
During your time here, this place has changed in a lot of different respects, but one very noticeable respect is in terms of its diversification, both in terms of students and faculty members, I think particularly faculty members who are women, and then also when it comes to students and faculty members of color. I was wondering, what kind of conscious efforts went into that change, and how do you kind of think about how Sanford has handled that?
It's all been good. Moving in that direction has been terrific. A policy program ought to have lots of different groups represented. It should not be all white males. It should not be all white males and females. There ought to be people bringing different perspectives, some from other countries. So I've been a big supporter of all the diversity efforts we've had. I can't say that I've played a major role. I can think of some of my more junior colleagues who played a more aggressive role in bringing in different people. But anytime I chaired a search committee, we would look for people who were not just like us. And I was delighted over time as we hired more women, more minorities, and it's been an exciting place.
In 2011, you were the president of the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management, and I actually don't know if it's pronounced APAM or APAM.
Different people pronounce it different ways, and I pronounce it different ways at different times. So I usually say APAM, but others say doesn't matter. It's the Association for Public Policy, and that association has been very important to my career. It was started, public policy programs started only in the early 70s, and then when I was at the Kennedy School in the early 80s, that was about when APAM was set up, and I can't remember the exact detail, but I was aware of it at the Kennedy School. Kennedy School faculty members were playing a big role. Bob Bain from here was playing a big role in the establishment. Joel Fleischman played a big role in the establishment of APAM and was its first president. I think Bob Bain was the treasurer at one point when I came down here. He was certainly on the board.
He told me he did that when he started getting serious about actually being a tenured professor, that he actually had to contribute in some way. So
right, yes. So, but anyway, he was contributing. Yeah. And so APAM was a link for me, a link with Duke, because there were people from Duke involved in APAM. There were people at the Kennedy School involved in it. And so it was an organization that I was involved in presenting papers, and I won an award early on. It was when I was at the Kennedy School, and I remember a senior person at the Kennedy School saying, one of our faculty members has just won an award or is about to win an award, and turned out it was me, but I don't think anybody was going to guess it was me because I was still junior there, but that gave me some improved my reputation at the Kennedy School and also within APAM. So then I from then on was pretty active in APAM and was pleased to be president in 2011. And the neat thing about that, when you're president, you run the conference the year before you're president. And the year I ran the conference was in Boston. And that was nice. That was a nice way. Had been down here for many, many years, knew lots of people in Boston and the conference that I ran. So I could call people up and get them more involved in various ways. And so that was rewarding.
What have you observed about how public policy as a field broadly has evolved or changed from the early 1980s, say, to when you were president in 2011?
So it started out with a big focus on analytic thinking. It was policy analysis. Mm-hmm. Notice APAM is Policy Association for Policy Analysis and Management. Mm-hmm. The schools initially didn't do much with management because they were trying to distinguish themselves from the schools of public administration. Mm-hmm. And the schools of public administration were we're training people how to administer programs, so a lot of budgeting and administration, not thinking about stepping back and policy making, although in fact managers often do, by the decisions they make policy. Mm. So one of the big changes over time was to incorporate more management into the field of public policy. And that was a good thing. I mean, it's not enough just to have analysts. The reason in addition, a second reason for starting out initially just focusing on the analysis was the notion was that a lot of our graduates from public policy programs might go work in these big analytic shops in government agencies, the EPA, for example, or in Treasury or the Labor Department. The idea was, students and people in those agencies needed to do all of this analysis. And the state government set up analytic shops. But then over time, funding for some of those analytic shops has declined, mm-hmm. and people coming out of public policy programs don't always have clear places to fit into the process. There's a much broader set of opportunities for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like there's been an increasing number of people who go into something that they think of as social entrepreneurship or something instead, that involves a lot of the private sector nonprofits and that world instead. And that seems like a shift from early on.
There have been ups and downs in job markets, and right now the job market, the federal government job market is down. Not terrific. So people have looked for other things. And I used to do work in state and local public finance, and I push people in that direction. And then you keep pushing, and that to the decentralized level, and that leads to lots of various activities, including a number in the nonprofit sector.
One of the overarching aspects of your career is that you have worked on issues that are directly policy relevant. Public finance, you were speaking to crucial conversations that were going on that had to do with these budget crunches that state and local governments were facing during the economic downturns in the 1970s and into the 1980s. Education reform, huge topic that was creating a lot of consternation and discussion, but you were trying to shed light on it from this sort of policy perspective in order to inform real concrete policy choices that politicians and policymakers were making. Do you think of yourself as a public intellectual? How do you line yourself up there?
The question is, what is a public intellectual? And I hadn't thought about that term too much until I was interviewed about it for another purpose, and it forced me to think, who am I? What is it that I do? Some public intellectuals might do contract work with the public sector. That's not generally what I do. That doesn't mean I haven't done any, but that's not my role. Another set of public intellectuals might think big and write lots of blogs and about policy issues and write for newspapers or whatever. And I do a little of that. But the main thing I like to do is good, solid research on topics that are policy relevant, that are consistent with the values I care about. So I do a lot of work related to distributional types of effects of policies. So what I like to do is do work on these important topics, and then I'm happy to write blogs or to talk at conferences about them, but based on my research, not just based on my general thinking about them. Does that make sense?
I'm struck by the fact that when you entered into education as a field, you were producing a lot of scholarship that would create sort of evidence-based policy choice. But now you're actually critical in some respects of this framing of evidence-based
Evidence is
practices.
important,
Yeah.
but come back to my work on values. My most recent book, maybe my last one, who knows, I'm really quite proud of, and it's called Educational Goods, Values, Evidence, and Decision Making. And I've written it with another social scientist like me, trained as an economist, and two philosophers. And philosophers clearly think a lot about values and more systematically than I have in the past. And we had to make up the term educational goods. And educational goods, just briefly, are the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and dispositions that enable someone to lead a flourishing life and to contribute to the others. And they come out of an educational process, broadly defined. So a key theme in the book is that policy, good decisions, should be values-driven and evidence-informed, but not evidence-driven. And this has become increasingly important for me as I think about education policy. If you focus on policies being evidence-driven, what that means, has meant for the last 8 or 10 years or so, is that the only valued outcome you focus on is student test scores, because that's what you have evidence on. We have all this data, and I've used a lot of that data myself, but what is the outcome we have? Test scores. But clearly, as a country, we care more about, or there's a lot more to education than we care about than, or should care about, than teaching students how to do well on standardized tests. So that's what educational goods, which is a term we had to make up, is all about. So I really feel strongly about this, that good policy, whether it's education policy or other policies, should start with the values. What is it we care about? What is it we value? The next step then is to say, okay, what are the policy options that are on the table or almost on the table? We don't want to narrow it too soon to just the things that are very much on the table. Let's think broadly about this, and then bring evidence to bear to determine the extent to which each of the policy options that are possible might realize the values. And some of them won't. The evidence and the social science research shows that there are all sorts of unintended negative effects, or that they don't have the effects they want. So we're bringing evidence in, and that's crucial to the whole thought process. But starting with values, what it is we care about. What are we trying to produce through the education system or any other policy area you want to talk about?
How have you thought in terms of your career about how to make the move from producing this sort of knowledge, whether it's actual papers that suggest certain policies or another, or this more recent book, Educational Goods? How do you try to connect that to policymakers, to practitioners? Is that something that you consciously think of as you have a responsibility to try to do that work, or do you just try to put it out there, make sure that the right people know about it, and let it go from there?
Well, so I like to give talks about it. So, and as I say, I have co-authors on the educational books, but I was the one who took the lead in making sure we were on the program for APAM. That I took the lead in making sure we were on the program for the Association for Education, Finance, and Policy, which I've been very active in over the years. Next week, I'll be going out to the American Education Research Association meetings. Two of my co-authors are taking the lead on the session we're presenting there, although I'll chair the session. So that's important. Last week, I gave a talk in Wake County. So I accept invitations. So this was for Wake Up Wake, and they were having an education forum to try to get the superintendent and other people and advocates for education in Wake County to think about these issues. So I'll talk about those. And I've written some op-eds and things. But there are a variety of ways. But ideas like this, I mean, this notion of educational goods, they're not going to be accepted overnight. One has to keep talking about them, and one hopes that over time they'll sink in, and then the political process has to be ready to change. And I think we're beginning to see that. Even in this state, we have some people saying, oh, maybe we're putting too much focus on test scores. Well, so if we don't do that, what do we do? So then it's useful to have some research ideas out there.
And you're sitting on the Governor Cooper's commission on access to sound basic education.
Yes.
Another forum for you to...
Yes, so that's a forum and I'm bringing to bear a lot of my previous research on teacher labor markets and early childhood and finance. So it's all coming together so that it's a good opportunity. What we come up with remains to be seen. Policy making is a process, and even in our book, Educational Goods, we're not telling people what we think the right policy is. We're saying, look, we need a language about values, and we need to discuss these values and which ones we can achieve or realize through various policy options. So it's not a matter of saying this is the right answer and that's the wrong answer. It's a matter of getting people to think more broadly about what it is we're trying to accomplish.
I hear in the way you're describing that a very sophisticated understanding of the policy process. And so, as we're coming to a close with this interview, I wonder if you could speak to whether that's something you find very much informed by doing all of this research here at the Sanford School of Public Policy, and previously the Sanford Institute.
I'm not sure this fully answers your question, but I've always said there's a role for analysis of various types, whether it's economic analysis, statistical analysis, ethical analysis, whatever. But then the political process is where conflicting values are resolved. And it has to be through a political process in a democratic society. We don't want an autocrat deciding what is right or what is wrong. So I've never thought that I've had answers. I've had ways of thinking that I hope will improve the outcome of the political process. But the political process is central to decision making among people with different values.
Is there anything else that you kind of see reflecting back on what this place was when you arrived here in 1986 and what it is now?
Well, it's certainly grown. There were 14 faculty members when I came, and I don't know how many there are now, 43 tenured, 44 tenured faculty plus a lot more. And it's been exciting for me to be here during this period of growth, and it's growth of all types, numbers of faculty, issues we deal with. We've become more internationally oriented. We could probably become even more internationally oriented. So it's been an exciting ride, and I'm glad to have been here.